So there was really two things I wanted to touch on. Actually, before I get to that, I'll give a brief intro. If you don't know, I just filled the position of Director of Personal Property Management Policy within the Office of Government-Wide Policy at GSA. Joined here in January, and then COVID came around, so that's been interesting. But it's been a great experience, huge learning curve, still have so much more to learn. But two things I wanted to touch on was one, regulations, which is a significant part of what we do in the office here, and then data and as it relates to regulations. Before I got to GSA, I certainly knew that there was this big gap between acquisition and disposal. I often would reach out to GSA and say, but what about this middle part? What do we do? And typically the response was referring us to standards, encouraging us to reach out to other agencies for best practices. And so that's what we did, and that's what other agencies do. My thought on that is that we, the office that we're in, the part that we play in that, is that we need to, where it makes sense, to continue to push the envelope on our authority to write regulation for that in-use portion of the life cycle, which is, for me, where I sit, is critical. You know, it's like what Jim was saying a number of days ago. It's really the part of where we extract the value from our assets. And so I see one of the significant responsibilities in our office is to persevere and be patient in trying to do that where it makes sense. You know, my understanding, and Dave, you know, was at GSA for decades. I'm sure he's aware of the many efforts in trying to do that. There have been reasons, my understanding, I've already been in conversations in trying to do just that. There are valid reasons. And one of the big education I've had is understanding the lens of the different stakeholders, how they see this issue, the concerns that they have, and really my challenge is to address those. So where data falls into that is very much integrated into regulation. I simply, there has to be an effective manager of your portfolio, there has to be an integration, again, from where I sit, from acquisition through the in-use portion of those assets to disposal and repeat as appropriate. I certainly see it as a circular path, and where data has to play a part in that. The previous agency I was at, we quickly realized how difficult it is to do that and wrap our hands around that. The large agency I was at, basically the organization, similar to the way regulations are written, is the agencies or the smaller organizations are left to their own devices to come up with policy, to establish data and systems, and then down the road, if you try to pull all those organizations, the policies and the data together after the fact, it's an extremely complex and difficult thing to do, to establish taxonomies and data dictionaries where the data is really apples to apples. But it's something that I think is certainly worth the effort. Fortunately, in the meantime, we have these wonderful standards and these extremely smart people that have worked and continue to work on establishing that to assist in that effort. I think where I sit is to the challenge is to focus on the short term and the decisions right in front of you, but always keep in mind the long-term goal. I'm still working to figure that out. When I often am challenged with that, I reach out to the smarter folks in the room to help me keep that goal in mind. So those are generally the thoughts I had. Are there any questions? Bob, I don't know if anything's come across.
I haven't seen anything come across, but I do have a question, and that is, you know, as before I was talking to Amber and I asked about standards. And so I was curious about where the GSA is, and particularly your office, and how you're looking at standards and what standards, and are you looking at applying any of those more, you know, like ISO 55000, for example, into the overall initiative that you've got going, particularly the area with, you talked about the data and the taxonomies of getting standardized data to be able to talk about assets in a consistent fashion across the entire landscape.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. My answer is similar to Amber's. It's really about looking at ISO 55000 as the framework, the overlay, it's really in a way kind of keeping the long-term goal in mind of what we're really trying to do, is keeping that framework in mind when we're making the decisions that are right in front of us. For me, and also at the prior agency I was at, it's been extremely helpful in keeping that in mind, and also helping to educate the other stakeholders involved, particularly in the regulation side. You know, they certainly have their perspective, but I see it as my responsibility to, again, educate them. And I often rely on ISO 55000 and other standards in doing that education.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a question from Marty Rowland, and it describe how value is created with personal property. Do we always compare against having non-movable assets?
Yeah, so value to me, and again, I'll go back to my time at my prior agency, is I was always, any opportunity I got was trying to break down the barriers between our various offices. So a really easy example that I often used was the CIO office, the significant amount of IT assets. And I often made the argument, you know, I would often 6 or 8 months after getting a brand new iPhone or BlackBerry, then someone would show up in my office and give me a new one. It was perfectly fine. I didn't need a new one. So could we have the conversation about extending, you know, the life cycle of those assets? You know, and if we were to do that, I often use the Jim Dieter example is, you know, if we take the line item on the financial statements and we were to extract 1% more from those assets, that's a pretty significant number. IT assets is an easy example because we all use them. I think we're all familiar with, you know, from the IT perspective, I get it. They're very interested in you know, the updating technology and all the things that they have to be concerned about. But if we, again, break down those walls, those barriers with the IT office, with the finance office, the procurement office, the real property office, and have more discussions across those offices to hopefully make better decisions.
So are there any thoughts about working towards compliance mechanisms in any of these areas, like audits, perhaps based on strategic asset management plans, for example?
Well, my office really isn't a compliance arm. Again, I'll go back to my prior agency I was at. That was a real struggle, the compliance piece. We often would argue with the auditors as they often come through, and they would take a close look and say, hey, your policies are pretty good, but how do you know they're actually doing it? And we would say, we simply don't have the resources. It really came down to resources. But we started to figure out small ways to conduct assessments to get a general sense of how the organizations were doing. I think probably the most benefit, instead of coming through with the stick and beating folks over the head for not complying, was really about having just that conversation from folks in the field on how the policies were received and how how ultimately we could improve our policy. Because I mean, here at GSA, I certainly see the regulations as just that. It's got to be helpful to those that have to comply with it. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does, and thank you. It's kind of hard to mandate compliance, and it's kind of like herding cats. And I'm sure Amber has a lot of stories about trying to herd those cats around. Some of that may just come down to training, and for people to understand what asset management is all about. And so, kind of the follow-up question that came from Boyd Beal was, do you have any mandated training for people on asset management or ISO 55000 or any other subjects that would appropriate apply to what you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about the mandate aspect of that, but I do know, and Dave could certainly talk more about this, but on the operational side of GSA, in regards to personal property, there's a significant amount of training that they conduct year in and year out. As many folks in the government know, for better or for worse, those that are actually truly managing assets in the field, it's often collateral duty. They often, some don't necessarily take much interest in doing that, but probably more important is their folks are often brand new to that task. So it's a big challenge in keeping folks up to speed on how to properly manage their assets. And like I said, on the operational side of GSA, they do a tremendous job with significant amount of training throughout the year.
Great. So as we're coming down to kind of the end of this little subsection of our panel today, I have a question that came in, and it was like, coming from a background in multiple agencies, what was your biggest surprise coming into your current role?
Oh, wow. That's really easy. I have to say, there was a bit of arrogance stepping into this position, thinking that I knew a lot about the regulations and how they are interchanged with themselves, and I didn't know much at all. And so it's been very humbling and really a wonderful experience so far. I've just been here a little less than a year. But yeah, is really, that's been the biggest thing is, I started well, actually, I started as an auditor on the private side. And then at the property management system arena for a little bit, and then have been at Commerce, DHS, and now GSA. Throughout all that experience, I thought I had the regs down pat. Nope. I've got a lot to learn, and it's actually wonderful because it seems like every day I get questions, for those affected by the regs and asking for interpretation and how does this relate to standards and so on and so forth. It's just wonderful and such a great education for me. So that's definitely been it.
Yeah, well, there's that great aspect of regulations and following regulations, but it seems to me that leadership is the most important attribute that somebody has in terms of making significant change and positive change and improvement in asset management systems. And you have you're kind of a shining star for taking on leadership roles and exhibiting outstanding leadership, and that's one of the reasons why you are where you are today. And I'm just curious as what you might be able to tell people on this about sort of leadership training, where they might go for it, what they may do to improve their leadership skills, and what have you done that's helped you in your career to get to this point where you are a significant leader in the federal government?
Wow. Part of that was tremendous compliment. Thank you so much. I don't know if it was deserved. But to answer the question, I probably the biggest thing I've learned for me in my professional career about leadership is really about listening to those affected by the decisions that I make, and also listening to my colleagues, and being very aware of particularly the strong leaders around me, and doing the best I can. I often, one of my officers in the Navy that was my supervisor for a period of time, he often used the idea of the good bag and bad bag, and always being aware of the good things that you see around you, and keeping track of that in the good bag, and anything bad you see, make sure you're just as aware of that. So beyond that, as far as leadership training, there's particularly in the last 5 or 10 years, plethora of training, not just in, organizations that do just that, but also I've found just recently is a lot of the more significant universities across our country are providing really good training regarding leadership. I actually just took one the last 6 or 8 weeks at the Darden School at UVA. And the title was Leading Mindfully During Crisis. I thought it was appropriate considering, our situation that we're in. And it was a wonderful class, not just the instructors, but the participants learned so much from them. So